Hello again, everyone, and welcome back to Reddit Aliens. I'm John, and as always, thank you so much for being here. Good topic? Let's do it. What's the worst story that you know about? Please remember to like, share, and subscribe. A cult called the Ant Hill Kids started off as an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, ended with a maniacal cult leader torturing his followers by burning people's genitals with blowtorches, stabbing people with hypodermic needles, then breaking them off under the skin, nailing kids to trees, and having other kids throw rocks at them, chopping off a woman's hand, and eventually killing another woman by performing a DIY operation on her. He then tried to revive her by drilling a hole into her skull and ejaculating into it. Even after he was arrested and convicted for all of this, some of his followers moved to a house near the prison so they could visit him regularly. Thankfully, he got stabbed in the neck by another prisoner and died. A special needs man in my hometown fell in with some sketchy redneck brothers and ended up tied to a radiator where he was savagely beaten, mutilated, starved for months, and ultimately dumped in a quarry in New Hampshire. They invited visitors to participate in the torture. Some did willingly, some out of fear. Before he died, they were feeding him his own legs. My dad grew up around the corner from Gary Heindick and used to deliver his newspaper. The time frame matches with his crimes. If you don't know who that is, in the late 80s, he dug a pit in his basement where he kept young women who he tortured, and murdered. He was eventually used as one of the inspirations for Buffalo Bill in Silence of the Lambs, along with Ed Gein and Ted Bundy. The story of Josef Fritzl and his daughter Elizabeth. Josef was a guy that grew up in an extremely abusive household during Nazi rule of Austria. Eventually he moved out, became an engineer, and married his wife Rose. He unfortunately would carry on the cycle of abuse to his own family, and was even jailed for breaking into a woman's house and arring her at knife point. Rose stood by him through his imprisonment, and his conviction was expunged after 15 years. He had a number of kids with Rose, and one particular girl, Elizabeth, would get the brunt of his abuse because she was the only one who would try to stand up to him. Josef is believed to have started molesting Elizabeth at 11 and developed a disturbing obsession with her, which led to her and a close friend running away to Vienna at 16. She was reported missing and brought back to her family by police a few weeks later. She turned 18, and a few months after this she disappeared. Her family filed another missing persons report, but a few days later a note arrived where Elizabeth told her parents she was sick of living with them and had left to join a cult. She was 18, so the police took it for granted and did not investigate much further. Over the next 24 years, babies would periodically show up at Josef's front door with notes from Elizabeth stating that she couldn't care for the children in the cult and was giving them to her parents. CPS, or the Austrian equivalent, didn't find this odd and never followed up. Josef and Rose adopted the kids and went on to raise them. One day, after those 24 years, Josef shows up at the hospital with a 19-year-old girl named Kirsten. She's deathly ill, extremely malnourished, missing nearly all of her teeth, and her skin is completely translucent. Doctors try to get Josef's help to determine what is wrong, but all he does is hand them a note from Elizabeth with a description of her symptoms and tells the doctor she dropped her at his doorstep. Doctors put on a televised plea for Elizabeth to come forward, and about 2 weeks later, Josef arrives with Elizabeth. She's 42, but looks like a woman of 70 and has the same translucent skin as Kirsten. The police were waiting for them, and upon their arrival, separated the two. Elizabeth confirms her father's story and insists the same over the next few hours. Then the police come back and tell her she's likely going to be charged with criminal neglect of a child. that her children will be separated from her and go into the system. Then something switches. "If I tell you, you won't believe me," she'd sheepishly say, and would repeat the same for several minutes before saying, "Promise me I'll never have to see him, Yosef, again, and I'll tell you everything." And the police agree. Over the next several hours, Elizabeth would recount her harrowing ordeal. Shortly before Elizabeth ran away to Vienna, Yosef applied for a permit to build a bomb shelter below his house, as many did during the Cold War. A few weeks after Elizabeth's 18th birthday, Yosef asked for her help in placing the last door to the shelter, and when it was in place, she turned to leave. He shoved a chloroformed rag into her mouth. She woke up in the dark. Yosef never intended to build a bomb shelter. He was building a prison for Elizabeth. Over the next 24 years, Yosef would come down to that cellar daily, usually twice a day, to R and beat Elizabeth, eventually fathering 7 children with her because he refused to use protection. She would give birth to each one of them alone, in the dark, with nothing but a baby book and rusted scissors. He let Elizabeth keep 3 of them, but took the others up to live with him in rows. He'd take pictures with the upstairs children at pools or the park and use them to taunt the basement children. Worse than that, he'd force them to watch as he routinely abused their mother. Police got the security code to Yosef's prison and freed the remaining children, and when the youngest, 6, boy saw the sky for the first time, he pointed up and asked, "Is that where God lives?" Officers had to work in shifts during the investigation of the cellar because there wasn't enough air to breathe, and the cellar was infested with mold. Yosef is in his 80s now and still in prison. He was allowed to change his name and move prisons after a group of inmates knocked out his teeth when they discovered his crime. He recently was moved to a lower security prison after a diagnosis of dementia. Elizabeth lives with all her kids in an undisclosed location in the Austrian countryside, where they are under constant surveillance by police and a town of fiercely protective neighbors. TLDR, Yosef Fritzl used building a bomb shelter as a guise to build a cramped prison for his 18-year-old daughter. The day the prison was finished, he ambushed her with chloroform and would keep her locked inside a sex slave for the next 24 years. Never being permitted to leave her prison, he would go on to father 7 children with his daughter. We've read about Yosef and Elizabeth before, and it's never cool. Just absolutely horrible. And the fact that he was allowed to change his name and move prisons, I don't know why. She wasn't. The pariah diving incident. The details are grim. Saturation diving allows humans to work in shifts in a habitat at depth and sleeping, etc., without needing to surface. If you need a visual image, stand near an oil pipe and remove the cap plug, and suddenly, violently, it turns out the pipe had created an air vacuum. Suddenly, you and all your buddies are sucked into this pipe and transported hundreds of feet in a couple of seconds. You regain consciousness in the middle of a pipe just big enough to fit your torso. It's pitch black, it's wet, and there's oil everywhere. You can't move. Your legs and arms are broken. What do you do? Oh wait, your buddy is right above you, and another below you. You're running out of oxygen, and no one can save you. You die slowly. I mean, I know the serial killers and whatnot, but I'm guessing you mean more homegrown and personal. I work in confined spaces with a lot of high-pressure water. I took to heart the rule of never tying off the trigger on a water blaster. It's a hard trigger to pull and keep down 100%, so I see the appeal. But there was the guy who got slowly cut to pieces, working inside the hull of a boat with one. He was working by himself. Don't do that. And after he started, it's assumed he duct-taped the trigger down. A water blaster gun exerts about 100 pounds of pressure backwards on the gun constantly while the trigger is pulled. The one I worked with steadily put out 15K of a hole, about half the diameter of a cigarette. I was able to cut a metal door on a busted up truck with it. Someone figured out something was wrong after loud, chaotic thuds were coming from the hull of the ship. He had lost his handle on the gun and killed him pretty quickly. Nobody could get to the water source or the machine, so they had to wait for the water blaster to run out of diesel before they could turn it off. I never saw pictures of that, but I did see pictures of what happens to fingers and hands when they get hit by a water blaster. Realizing it's pumping about 2 tall boys worth of water into you in half a second, it makes sense why a hand would look like a hot dog microwave for too long. So kind of regional, but Netflix had that one giant expose on cults in South Korea. While I knew a few of their existence, some of them go leagues deeper than what was shown on Netflix. Starving, beating, and eventually even gaslighting the parents of a 5-year-old to kill a kid who, by all means, was just being a rebellious kid because that's what kids effing do, was just a part of the effed up stuff from one of the cults. South Korea's defamation laws are quite BS, so I have a feeling Netflix unfortunately had to go a little easy. Edit. Should clarify. Given that I know Korean, and I know some local broadcast programs, and unfortunately even ex-members of some of these cults, what I've been told, which cannot be just said in public, I mean it's a country where you can get sued for defamation by a bald guy if you call him bald, really just went to show the documentary was scratching the surface. The fact that the case of Five Oceans Trading Company somehow even had some ties to the MV Seoul incident was chilling. When my grandma was a little kid living in the cold water flats, there was an intellectually disabled kid a few years older who lived across the way. His mom used to let him wear her dresses and play around the fire pit they burned their trash in. As you might expect, the dress caught fire one day while my grandma happened to be watching out the window. I guess she was the only one who saw it or cared, but she just kind of froze up, so this kid ran around in utter silence until he dropped dead. The image of his footprints, burned into the grass, were burned into her memory for the rest of her 80-plus years, and has been burned into my memory secondhand since she told me 20-plus years ago, when I was also a kid. You know that movie with Jack Black called Bernie? That's based on my friend's grandmother. Bernie shot her in the back and kept her body in the garage freezer for 6 months. He kept spending her money and telling her family she was fine. Obviously, she was not. I hate Jack Black for this because he became friends with Bernie and tried to get him out of prison. Bernie was kept in jail after a second trial. They've never recovered any of her money that he stole. Everyone supports Bernie because he was nice and my friend's grandmother was a mean lady. But even mean ladies don't deserve to be murdered. Happened in my hometown. Random man, who was a registered nurse and former college football player, randomly drove from Indiana to central Kentucky, parked his car on a road in a neighborhood, and then entered a random house. The door was unlocked because the mother was getting off work late that night, so her husband left the door unlocked for her. The man grabbed a knife from the kitchen and murdered the 6-year-old boy in his bedroom. The boy, Logan, had 3 sisters in the house as well. One of them got stabbed as well. The dad of Logan fought the intruder and was able to hold him down and contain him until police arrived. I think the dad didn't know anything had really happened to his son until after the police took the guy into custody. There are plenty of suspicious details surrounding the entire thing. The murderer pled insanity, but I knew people that worked at the jail. The guy was not insane. He ended up getting found not guilty based on insanity. He did get 20 years for the assault of the family, but he was eligible for parole in 2019. For all I know, he could be out already. Prosecutors were going for the death penalty. I also knew the father of the murdered boy. I haven't seen him in 20 years, but I think about it often. And when I'm in my hometown, I pass that street, and I can't imagine how horrible that must be to have a family member, child, taken like that. A few years ago, I was walking through the woods off the beaten track a bit, and I smelled this really overpowering sweet smell. Being nosy, I pulled back the undergrowth to have a look and found a dead body. The guy had clearly been there a while and wasn't looking great, all swollen and green and black with various runny bits. The local wildlife had been dining well for a few days. I called the police, who told me to wait with the body until they arrived. Being in the middle of nowhere, it took a while for them to arrive, and it got dark, and I was just sat there in the dark with him for a long time. It turned out he had committed suicide. For a long time afterwards, I had dreams about him, and he would talk to me, and not nice things, mainly about how he was angry I had disturbed his resting place, and he wanted me to kill myself. Probably just my imagination, but all pretty disturbing at the time. He still turns up in my dreams from time to time, and no doubt will be tonight after typing this. I wouldn't say it's the worst, but it's the first that comes to mind. My ex was the daughter of two Chinese immigrants who both became doctors after moving to the US. Whatever stereotype you may have of harsh Asian parents you're thinking about, it's accurate. A story that really stuck with me was when she got a B in kindergarten. I don't remember what the subject even was, but her parents were furious, so they left her alone in the parking lot and drove off. They came back 30 minutes later and said, "Did you learn your lesson? Now get in." Shanda Scherer, Southern Indiana, 1992. She was a 12-year-old in 7th grade. She committed the infraction of dating the ex-girlfriend of a girl named Melinda Loveless. Loveless and 3 other girls, all between the ages of 15 and 17, threw her in the trunk of a car and drove around, periodically letting her out of the trunk just to beat the hell out of her, including stabbing attempts to slit her throat. Eventually, they lit her on fire and left her there to die. They even stopped to eat and joked amongst themselves that their french fries were burnt like Shanda. The autopsy showed that she died of smoke inhalation, as the only thing that was burning was her. She died from inhaling the smoke of her own flesh. All 4 of the girls involved have subsequently been paroled or completed their sentences and are no longer in prison. We used to live a couple miles from our state's biggest psychiatric hospital. One day when I was like 7 or 8, we got a call from the sheriff's office telling us to lock ourselves inside and keep them on speed dial and ensure that every door and window in the house was locked. Dad worked at the hospital at the time, and we had no idea what was even going on until he got home and told us. Apparently, a few very dangerous patients escaped through an old tunnel and were somewhere in the community. No one knew where they went, and they all had histories of murder, crimes, etc. At that age, I didn't have any concept of proactive safety, so all I could think of was a few criminally insane people kicking the door and killing us. It took them hours to finally apprehend the patients, but the whole time Mom and Dad were constantly checking the doors, and Dad got his guns out. One of the reasons he was so paranoid was that he, being an employee at the hospital, was most likely a potential target for them, and it was impossible to know if they were aware of where he lived. According to him, they were some seriously frightening people, considering they were in the highest security ward, and he had no idea how they escaped, but the implications were pretty grim. Until they were found, you could look outside, and there was no one around. Grandma later said she decided to go on a walk for some reason, and she said no one was outside, and one of her neighbors told her to get back inside. Pretty creepy stuff. The Bever brothers, or the Broken Arrow murders. 16 and 18-year-old brothers plotted to kill their family and then going on a killing spree to be famous. They had previously asked their 13-year-old sister, Crystal, if she wanted to be involved, and when she told her parents, she got the old boys will be boys excuse. On the night of the killings, they started with her, not expecting the fight she put up. She had her throat slit and was stabbed, but managed to scream out to her siblings to hide. They killed their parents, but their 12-year-old brother managed to call 911. The 16-year-old Michael tricked him into opening the door, saying their brother Robert was attacking him too. They killed him, then used the same ruse to get in and kill their 7-year-old brother and 5-year-old sister. They were planning on decapitating the 2-year-old sister, but thankfully that 911 call derailed the rest of their plans, and Crystal survived her injuries. Their mom had a Reddit account, Aoki Mom. She commented about how the world would benefit from her kids being in it.